Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Skye White, VP at Deed. With her unique blend of environmental and social impact experience, Skye currently helps companies become better corporate citizens through her role as VP of Business Development at Deed. Deed is a corporate giving platform, and I think it's really a lot more than that as we get into in this conversation. And I was excited to bring Skye on. This is a topic I've not covered here before, but I think a lot of organizations are paying attention to what their employees want. And one of the things that their employees want are ways to make an impact in the world. We hear that a lot more now, especially with younger generations, but with older generations too. People saying, how can I make an impact? How does my work make an impact? How does my company make an impact? What can we do to be doing the most good here on this planet while we're here doing the work that we're doing? And we get really into that here in this conversation. We talk all about corporate giving, both of time and money, how companies are organizing it, where companies go wrong, mistakes that some organizations have made, and some big successes that other companies have had. And so I'm really excited to share this with you. I think there's a lot of really good practical stuff for anybody leading a business or leading a group of people who want to have an impact and give back with what they do. Here is Skye White. Skye, welcome to the show. Very excited to have you on. And, I wasn't quite sure how to say what we were going to talk about. So I think that's a good place to start. Is the nature of what you do, how do you define it? I was thinking on the one hand, like ESG seems a little broad, and on the other hand, corporate giving seems a little narrow. So would you mind explaining what Deed is and what it is you do?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point, especially because it's a very evolving, interesting space. The acronyms ESG, CSR, DE&I feel like those always get thrown around for audience that may or may not know CSR being corporate social responsibility. So yes, I work with Deed, and we help people do good deeds wherever they are through our platform and technology. And so really our vision is to help build a sense of community by helping people give back. And we want to make it just as easy to give back as it is to consume. So, all of us with a click of a button have Uber and DoorDash and, can swipe and get connected to people. What we want to do is make it just as easy for you to get connected to opportunities to do good in your community, whether that's donating to a nonprofit, volunteering, getting involved in sustainability, climate action, and things like that. So whatever that looks like for you, I'm just helping you, your employees and companies do good deeds.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarity on that. So let's just start at the beginning here. I think people who would listen to this podcast are interested in the people side of work have probably heard anecdotally that employees today want to make a difference. They want to have an impact. They want to do good in the world, especially younger employees. But I'd be curious, what are you actually seeing? Like what feedback are you getting from employees? Is it from all employees or just certain populations? And what are they looking to get out of work from this sort of impact giving standpoint?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it does shift and it does change according to demographic. So that's been really interesting to watch in this space over time. I think for everyone, what we've seen, observed qualitatively and then through the data as well, it's just that the pandemic really shifted things for a lot of people. I saw one statistic recently that said 7 out of 10 employees are rethinking the role of work in their lives. And then one of the most crushing statistics that always will stick with me was that at the beginning of the pandemic, around 50% of employees felt like their company cared about them. But by 2022, it was less than 25%. So just to think, walking around, less than 1 out of 4 of your people think that you as a company care about them. And so we're seeing that general sentiment across all demographics, people of all types, of all geographies. But we are seeing, especially like millennial and Gen Zs, nearly every HR leader I speak to, social impact leader I speak to says that when they're interviewing millennials and Gen Z, they get asked questions about what is the company doing for social impact in communities? What are we doing around climate change and sustainability? And so that's really kind of the demand that we continue to see, whether that's in the data or just anecdotally, as you said.
And are you seeing employees want to make a difference with the actual work they're doing? Or do you see that they just want to make sure that they're having that their workplace is creating a positive outcome or positive impact on the communities, or both?
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Kind of like, are you asking or sort of wondering, like, is my direct role focused on doing this impact versus can I just bring this passion for doing good in addition?
Yeah, can we raise money for a good cause versus does our work actually create good in the world?
Right. I think that's kind of where we do see a little bit of split in demographic difference. I think that more the millennial and Gen Z are looking to do good through their role a lot of times versus like demographics for everyone. Just want to make sure that at least you're able to give back to causes that you care about, maybe in addition to your role, even if your role directly is not doing that. But yeah, I would say definitely there's a general sense of expecting companies to do more. There's certainly more trust and expectation of accountability for companies today across all demographics. And so I would say just at the very basic level, everyone is just looking to say, okay, well, how can we give back to a cause that I personally care about? Or what is the company doing to better our communities around us?
Yeah, that makes sense. And the generational split in that makes sense to me, because just yesterday I was listening to somebody being interviewed about generations in the workplace, and that topic sort of wears on me a little bit, but I do think there's some good stuff there. And this person who I was listening to was really interesting, and she was sort of saying how the Gen X and the baby boomer populations are more like, you're lucky to have a job, you don't have to like it, just show up and do it, and climb the ladder or be successful or whatever. And so that would make sense that if that is your programming, not that all Gen X and baby boomers are that way, but if that is your programming or your lens that you're looking through, then yeah, we want to do good, but we're going to do that through more philanthropy type stuff, more giving, more volunteerism in the community versus the younger generation. They want to have more agency on it. So they want to know that the work that they're actually doing, the way they're spending their lives and their time is having an impact.
Exactly. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's sort of like for, as you mentioned, like Gen X and Boomer, it's sort of a nice to have on top of the role versus I think for Millennial and Gen Z, it's very much center to what they're going to do. And it's going to inform what type of role and career they want to take on, as well as the company that they're going to select. Yeah.
How many companies do you see, what rough percentage are offering opportunities to have an impact on their community? Let's take the work that they're doing out of it, because I think that's just going to depend on the type of company that you have in a lot of sense. If you're an oil company, there are things that you can do to have a real impact on improving the world, or at least making it less bad. If you're working on technology for plumbers, or some, if you're working on Uber, got some tech job, like there's not as much that hands-on that you're going to have impact on the world. Maybe those are bad examples, but you get the point. But I think from being able to get out into the community from a giving standpoint, whether that's time or money, everybody can do that regardless of where you are. So what percentage of the population do you see actually having programs in place and allowing their people to do that? Or maybe not even just allowing it, but actually organizing it as a workplace?
Right. Well, it's funny. So my background before I got into social impact and tech was in more environmental sustainability. So I was on the E side of ESG, and I first got connected to this space through someone I knew that was a VP of a company. And I thought, this is such an interesting space. Do they actually have clients that do this? Is there even a need for software that's going to connect you to nonprofits and volunteer opportunities and giving? And I thought, there's just no way that there's a whole market out there that's doing this. And sure enough, I would say just about every one of the Fortune leaders are doing this to some extent and some level. And we've just continued to see that across companies of all sizes and all geographies. And of course, it's always a little bit different per industry. And I certainly don't know off the top of my head, like an exact number that I would say percentage of all companies. But I would certainly say most of the Fortune are already doing this. I would say 70% plus. There's a really great resource report called Giving in Numbers every year. It's released by an organization called CECP. And they just examine data and these trends every year from companies of all sizes and seeing how the investment in these programs is changing and shifting over time. And so that's always a great resource to kind of go out and see like the general broad stroke, how many of these companies are investing in them. But I would certainly say of the Fortune, it's 70% and up. And then that's just continuing to grow, even with small companies.
I was going to say, do you see that kind of same percentage, or at least you don't know the exact number, obviously, but does it feel the same for mid-size and smaller companies too? Like this has become a part of the package of the work experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would kind of say that for the larger companies, this is something they've been doing for years and years and years, if not decades. For the small to medium, we are constantly getting outreach from those companies as well, because I think it's, just really recognized that companies of all sizes can benefit from this, and employees are demanding it regardless of if they're at a large or smaller company. And I think too, there's just so much more opportunity, even when you're in a small to medium business, to create a really close-knit culture around giving back. You just have a little bit more opportunity because you are a bit smaller to create that sense of community amongst your employees. So just find that there's so much opportunity. But yeah, we absolutely see both really engaging.
So before we get into the actual giving of your time and money, and I've got a bunch of questions around that, how do you see organizations selecting causes to support? What are the best practices there?
So as you kind of alluded to earlier, it's always interesting depending on what you do as a business, what industry you're in can certainly influence that lens that you're approaching. For best practice, regardless of size, industry, what you do as a company, we've certainly seen the space evolve in a good way from being a top-down to a more democratized approach. And that's certainly been driven, I think, by younger demographics, kind of going back to that theme of, millennials and Gen Z, really sort of wanting to bring their own personal interest to this space. I think giving is very personal. Nearly everyone is giving in some capacity. And so we've just continued to see as a best practice, more and more companies shifting from that old school philanthropy model where the executives are picking a few nonprofits and they're giving to those same nonprofits year over year, whether it's fundraiser or golf tournament or whatever that looks like, to now being more year-round democratized programs that are very open choice, which I know can sound really scary, but it has a ton of benefit and a ton of reward. Because at the end of the day, if this is about engagement and culture and your people are already giving back, you might as well tap into that and empower them and foster that connection in a really meaningful way. So I would say we're very much seeing that and have seen that and will continue to see that democratized approach. With that, I would say it's still really, really great to still have focus pillars as a company. And I find that that's really fantastic to just give employees that maybe don't have a personal cause that they care about some ways that they can immediately get plugged in. And so I think that's where you as a company have the opportunity to decide what causes align with your particular business and what makes sense. And then at the same time, empowering people with their personal choice.
And so what makes a pillar?
Yeah, good. I guess I should probably define that. So I would say pillar, probably a really old school term to use there. So maybe like a focus area or cause area are those sort of general themes that you as a company decide you're going to support. So if that is education, if that's mental health, if that's climate change, if you're a finance company, financial literacy, things like that can sort of be pillars. And so that's going to help inform, what nonprofits within that pillar strategically align, what sort of fundraisers or activities are you doing that are strategically aligned with that pillar. And most companies will have 3 to 4 that really align with the business, in addition to the open choice programs that they have.
So is it fair to say then that kind of best practice is that organizations will pick the values or pillars that they want to be investing time and money into, and then within those, allowing from the ground up people to sort of nominate the actual charities or organizations that they want to then support?
Yes, but I would say the open choice goes even further. So it's more so saying, we as a company care about these 4 things, but we're going to empower you to care about any of those causes outside of those pillars. Yeah. So even more broad.
Okay. So I thought I had answered my question, but now you opened it back up again. So I'm going to ask it. How do organizations do that while keeping guardrails that people aren't investing things that they don't agree with, or that, and don't agree with maybe is a sensitive term, but things that they don't want their organization associated with?
Yeah, no, it's super fair. Just about every company has some caveats to that. I've seen companies be as open as possible. One Fortune 10 company I worked with, 200,000 employees around the world, they had a whole data scientist dedicated to just these social impact programs and analyzing the engagement. And, when you're that size, you have representation in every demographic, on every political, spectrum and opinion. And so for them, they really truly were open choice to the extent that they included religious organizations and schools. But if there was an organization that was in the media for something sensitive, or there were particular sensitivities, those would of course be excluded, or there would be additional consideration around. Most companies I see tend to not support religious organizations just as a general blanket rule, unless there's like a secular arm of that organization. So like a food bank that's maybe run by a mosque or religious organization that's separate from that piece of it. So I would definitely say a lot of companies will just sort of have some of those exceptions and filter those out, but still allow the rest to be really open choice.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting into a really tricky time here where you have the sort of, I don't know, it feels like a weird fiasco around Bud Light having a trans influencer on the can, and that has created all kinds of backlash. And so now I could see other organizations saying, well, not that we don't support it, but we just want to stay away from it. It's just too politically charged right now. We don't want to get in the middle of that. Some might say, hey, we do want to take a side, and that's great. But some might say, we want to make our widgets, and we don't even want to dip our toe in that potential backlash.
We really are seeing both, because while maybe that created backlash for some people, it created huge fans and huge support for others. And I think that's where we are also seeing companies take really fierce stands. I think one of the things that was pointed out from that exact incident was that nearly every other beer company has also supported LGBTQ+ in some way or another. And it just maybe wasn't as known to some consumers. And so there's also a stat that most people in our space are so tired of talking about is this report that speaks to the fact that a lot of times consumers now are losing trust in historically trusted entities and placing more trust in companies now. And so, we are seeing a lot of companies take really interesting stances. And some, like you said, I think from an inclusivity standpoint, from the Fortune 10 company I worked with, they said, if we're going to be inclusive, we need to include everyone. And so we can't take a stand on anything, but we want to empower you to be who you are and to be authentically you. So we're going to support whatever you support in a very open way.
Interesting. And so let's get into then the giving versus the volunteering, because I think this is interesting too. And I guess I'll segue into this by saying, for those organizations that do want to empower people to contribute to anything that is near and dear to them, whichever side of the political spectrum it's on, religious spectrum, any of that, are they allowing you to sort of give of your money and time on your own, but we're not going to necessarily brand it with the company name? Or are they willing to allow everything to be branded with the company name?
Yeah, it is a bit of both. And I think a lot of that sometimes has to be driven just by budget and realities of the company. But definitely see a lot of times that, this is what we as a company care about. And so we're willing to put dollars behind that. We're going to sponsor this event. If you volunteer with it, we're going to reward you with dollars that you can donate to nonprofits. And so, yeah, we absolutely see sort of that divide. But then a lot of companies will say, just to your point, we're not going to personally match the dollars that you donate, but we'll certainly allow the nonprofit that you support for you to give to them through our payroll giving program. Or, you're certainly welcome to volunteer and log your hours, but, maybe we're not going to do the exact volunteer rewards with that. And so it really just, I think from that lens, aligns with that inclusivity value. And we know that giving is very personal in that way. And then there are some companies that are just truly open and say, no, you choose it and we're going to support it regardless.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate you going down that rabbit hole with me, because I do think that there are a lot of business leaders who are worried about those repercussions right now and are nervous to take too strong of a stance in any one area, because you never know what's going to set off a group. Are you going to set off the LGBTQ group? Are you going to set off a religious group? Are you going to set off gun owners, knitters? Which group is going to be offended by whatever the thing is that you put out? And I think we're seeing big reactions that maybe we wouldn't have expected, or the people who made those decisions wouldn't have expected. So I feel like there could be a big portion of the population that's gun shy to get into any of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always really interesting to kind of see the companies that are very vocal and out there with what they support, sort of tell their stories. But yeah, it's absolutely top of mind, I think, for any organization. I don't feel like I contributed very much there with that comment, so you can cut that out.
No, you're good. You're all good. So let's talk about giving first. We're, sort of tiptoed around this. What are best practices when it comes to corporate giving of dollars? How do they organize it? Are they matching or not matching? What do you see as best practices?
Yeah. So normally see kind of two buckets, and then of course like subcategories for those, where a company will have one bucket of budget and money that they're going to give to organizations that they support as a company that, again, sort of align with those cause areas and align with their business that they've identified. And so a lot of times that'll be in the form of grants, of sponsorships for organizations. And then on top of that, we'll then see a kind of a separate bucket that is more so to support employee choice. And that's being more so driven by employee engagement and wanting to build culture and inclusivity. And so that will include more like the matching dollars and the volunteer rewards. And then another kind of recent trend we've seen is the two coming together, where companies will oftentimes have several grants budgets, and one of them will be for employee nominated grants. And so we're kind of seeing that continue to be trending upward as well. So that's kind of the structure that we tend to see most companies do.
Okay. So just to say that back to you, kind of three buckets: the corporate directed giving, the employee directed giving, and then employee directed grants that are coming out of the company pool. So employee directed corporate giving, I guess.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. That didn't confuse everybody who was listening to this. What about volunteer time then? What are the best practices for establishing policies around volunteer time?
Yeah, I think there's so much flexibility and so many best practices around volunteering that you can do. Some interesting reasons like why to even begin with, or we've seen volunteering be incredibly beneficial for talent development. We tend to see that people that are volunteering in your company tend to develop those skills more. They tend to be more loyal to your company. They tend to earn promotions more. And so you're just getting a lot more retention out of that employee.
Is that just because of engagement? because if they're willing to go out and partner with their coworkers and do a project, like those are just the type of people who are more engaged in the world.
I mean, to your point, like there's that type of person that like is always going to do that. They're going to be out there doing those things. But I think, I mean, it's really powerful when you're going out and doing good with the people that you work with, especially in person. That was a huge trend. You know, everyone had to do virtual things during COVID. Now, almost no one is doing virtual volunteering anymore. I think we saw 96% of all volunteer events last year were in person. People want to come together and do that. And so it's just really, really powerful. So I think when you do that, you literally build a meaningful connection with your coworkers that you just can't do when you're in a meeting or talking about accounting or, you know, doing sales activities. You know, this is just incredibly powerful to build a more personal connection. And so I think that's kind of what we see tying into that. And then for how you structure that, one of the best practices I always recommend is to include it in your new hire onboarding in some way, shape, or form. So one of the favorite things that I've seen is companies that do different like onboarding with groups altogether. So if you have like waves, you know, every other week you have a new cohort coming on doing onboarding, go ahead and weave in a 1 hour group volunteer event together at that onboarding. And it immediately right away gives your employees a meaningful connection, an emotional connection to your company and to the peers that they volunteered with. So a lot of times you can just have one or two nonprofits that always need a group. You can kind of set it and repeat and just allow folks to immediately, as they are getting connected with you as a company, have that meaningful connection. And it really, we tend to see from the data that when that's done, that employee engages in that program long term, and then you get to see the benefits of that loyalty and retention that we just mentioned too.
Okay. And what's the standard these days as far as how many volunteer days companies are giving people?
Yeah, I would say on the more conservative side, 2 volunteer hours a year, but that's not to say that
2 hours.
Oh, I'm sorry, 2 days.
Okay.
Not that conservative. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's not to say that that's the only time they allow. I think most companies empower you to volunteer, whether it's inside or outside of working hours. And then you can log those hours and get whatever the volunteer reward is from the company. Most progressively have worked with really, really large companies that do weeks of volunteer time off or even volunteer sabbatical. I think SAP does this. It's one of my favorite programs where, and I think Ericsson too, you can apply for these big volunteer projects. And if you're approved, you actually get to go be dedicated to working with that nonprofit or that project for weeks or months at a time while still working with the company. And of course, there's just incredible, impactful stories when employees do that.
Yeah, I would imagine for organizations like that too, there's also an opportunity. You mentioned developing your people. Like you could give back to other nonprofits by doing what you do. Like if you're a services company, you could take your services and go offer them pro bono to another organization. And so you could take maybe up and comers or some younger people who needed some development and have them go do some projects for free somewhere that, you know, maybe don't need to be 100%. Maybe they could be 95%, you know, of the quality level, but that organization's thrilled to have them. And then you get to develop your people and put them on different projects. So I could see there'd be some really creative ways to do that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Another kind of interesting thing that we observe with volunteering is employees are motivated differently if they're in early, mid, or late stage in their career. And so we tend to see that employees that are in the late stage of their career, you know, have developed those amazing skills throughout the time. And they're now looking to give that insight and those skills back in a really strategic way. So a lot of times we'll see a lot of board service and those types of employees really motivated and want to sit on the boards of nonprofits. And so we see a ton of that versus, you know, early stage career employees want more access and visibility to leadership. They want to earn that visibility to executives. They want to earn the rewards. They want to climb up in the company. And so they tend to give that way versus mid-tier employees are super busy in the peak of their career, peak of their personal life. So they really look for convenient micro volunteering opportunities that they can just quickly jump into and jump out of. And so just even that is super, super interesting to see.
Yeah. As somebody who has been working now for, quick math, 17 years in the workforce and has a young family at home, I can say that I do not have as much time as I did before to volunteer. And so I definitely feel that, like, yeah, I would still love to do some great, impactful work, but I don't have the gluttony of time that I had way back when. And so I'm trying to be more selective and impactful with what I'm doing. Yeah, that resonates with me. Are there any good starter volunteer opportunities that companies can put in place to sort of test the waters on this? If they're not doing a lot of this now, are there good sort of easy ways to get into this type of work before just making it a free for all and letting people do whatever they want to do? Not that that's bad. Again, we talked about that can be good, but just for companies that want to dip their toe in and get comfortable with this before they open it up.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have seen in two different ways to be able to do that, or both. One, there are some great free platforms out there, or some that are pretty low budget that you can connect with that have turnkey, ready to go volunteer opportunities. Mostly looking at Volunteer Match is a great one if most of your workforce is in the US. Volunteer.gov here in the US as well has some great opportunities that connect back with like parks, national parks all across the US that folks can get engaged with. And then there's also another platform called Idealist that also has those volunteer opportunities ready to go. And so I find that those are really, really great, easy ways that if you're just saying, we don't want to give any corporate dollars, we just kind of want to test the waters, open it up to these, platforms that are going to have those turnkey, ready to go opportunities for you and allow folks to get engaged that way and test it. Alternatively, what I've also seen is, companies will pick 10 to 12 pretty popular nonprofits varied across the spectrum, and we'll work with them in partnership to create volunteer opportunities, partner with them, whatever that looks like, to get really creative and maybe test the waters that way. And that way you're sort of providing a well-rounded spectrum, but still a little bit more conservative if you're just kind of looking to get started.
Okay. And what are the common pitfalls or mistakes that companies make when they get into this type of work, whether it's giving of dollars or time or any other aspect of this? Where do you see people either make mistakes or struggle?
One pretty consistent one is the disconnect between employees and top executives sometimes. So we've seen in data that a lot of times executives will assume and think that their people care about these particular things, or they don't care about these other things. Meanwhile, it'll be exact opposite of that, where, come to find out, no, employees absolutely do care about this, or so sorry, they actually are not motivated by that particular cause. One of my favorite stories or examples of that, I, of course, will not mention the company name, but they're a large global company, 80,000 people around the world. And at the time that this was going on, it was during the rainforest fires. And, a lot of the world was observing this. It was, really terrible. Lots of talk about climate change and just what a loss that was from a natural resource standpoint for all of us to see those burning for weeks there at a time. At that time, employees across the company were sort of wanting to do something, wanting to give back, asking what they could do. The company didn't really move on it in a big way, just kind of let the murmurs fall. Shortly after that was when Notre Dame caught fire. And this company immediately, without question, committed millions of dollars to that. And of course, we were all heartbroken, beautiful, historic, iconic, like absolutely, we want to contribute to that. But they immediately got backlash within their company from employees because employees felt that the rainforest burning was more important from a global standpoint. And they wanted to see their company dollars supporting that cause instead of Notre Dame there. And so that actually sparked for them as a company a complete reevaluation of what they were doing around social impact and philanthropy and giving. And then that's kind of when they set out to get a full program that was democratized in technology, where they could just kind of make an open choice and really kind of change how they approach things.
Yeah, I could see that being a mistake for sure. Any other mistakes that you see people making?
I think a big one is we still sometimes see these programs in silos. And that is really, really difficult to have impact across the company and to make this really meaningful when you're sticking CSR or social impact into its own silo. What we see from the most effective and successful companies and programs is that it's more woven in across the entire company. And a lot of times we're seeing ESG, DE&I, and CSR at least all together in one department. But I always like to say CSR is a team sport. So being able to weave it into your sales efforts and your marketing efforts and thinking through, how can we involve consumers and vendors and customers all within our community impact and really amplify that brand reputation that you have in a really positive way. And then how can we weave that into our technology and whatever we're doing there? I think a lot of companies are then leveraging and donating even software to nonprofits, even if that's not what they do as a company, but just beginning to think of every area of the business where you can weave in that social impact for an internal and an external benefit at that point.
There are recently more stories coming out about detractors to ESG and CSR and that kind of a thing. I think it feels like it started with people who disagreed with Black Lives Matter and critical race theory. And it seems like those disagreements have sort of come into the ESG space recently. And I can't remember, I think it may be Montana that just passed a law that it won't allow, basically the government won't work with banks who have ESG protocols for their investments. And so you're starting to see ESG be tied into some of those types of stories. And I guess I would just be curious from your standpoint, what are the detractors saying for why this type of work maybe isn't what a company would want to do?
Yeah. And I would say to that, we are seeing both. So we're seeing people. I was with someone who was in ESG investment last night and has an incredible financial background. And for their company, they're tripling down. But I think for what I've heard from some of those that are critical of it, want to go back to that old school way of, the purpose of business is profit. And that is it, cut and dry. They don't want to complicate it. They don't want to, consider it other than the numbers aspect of it. And so I think it was quite a few really, really influential investors have come out and found that. I think from there, it's just really interesting to say, okay, well, how does that change over time? What are the demographics of that saying? Are there only particular demographics that tend to have that viewpoint? And I think it'll be really interesting to see over time kind of how that wins and plays out.
Yeah. If organizations are going to start to think about this and this sort of, I don't know, blowback is too strong a term, but if there continues to be naysaying out there about this and organizations are evaluating it, I just want to make sure that we're presenting the issues that they may run into in this conversation.
Yeah, no, totally. Absolutely fair. And I think we tend to see companies too, where that's kind of where they will sometimes silo. And I don't know if we need to put this in the podcast, but I'm thinking of one Fortune 10 company that's been in the headlines for some really challenging things. Some documentaries been made about them. So then they spin up, philanthropy programs to sort of cover up or make up for some of the bad that they do. So it's just, it's really interesting to kind of see some of that, areas that are absolutely up for critique.
Yeah, That's not the type of CSR, corporate social responsibility, we want to get into. It's not it's not to cover up for corporate social irresponsibility.
Right.
Yeah. One doesn't negate the other. Let's talk. The other part about this that I think is important to talk about is the actual impact of this work. And so how do you see companies tracking the impact of these efforts?
Yeah. And that's been a challenge for a lot of companies. And I think for a long time, what is easy to do is to track the outcomes. And so the difference being, okay, if we're hosting this event and we're volunteering at a food bank, we can track exactly that day how many people or how many meals we impacted. And so we can really get that metric down. What's difficult is then what we mean by impact is, okay, well, what did those meals make a difference for? Like, what did that one meal that we provided to that family or that child, what was the impact to them for the rest of the day? And that's a lot more complicated to be able to measure. And I think that's kind of where the space is continuing to evolve and continue to figure out. There are some great impact measurement platforms that are getting more sophisticated in this way. So there's like 3 or 4 different ones out there, but we're beginning to kind of see how we can utilize big data to then try and track, what that impact looks like, at least from a micro level. And then we'll continue to really see that at scale.
So I imagine that, probably the way it's being done mostly now is hours and dollars.
Yeah, I would say hours and dollars, but I would also add the outcomes aspect to that. So yeah, we gave this many hours, but we value that these hours were worth this amount saved to the nonprofit. So by donating, our accounting team skills to this nonprofit, that saved them X amount of dollars where they were then able to allocate to the other aspects of their program. Yeah.
So we're getting better at extrapolating out, not just we gave this many dollars, we volunteered this many hours, but we did that allowed this much investment back into their organization. And they are able to tell us that many dollars of investment in their kids or the planet or whatever leads to these types of outcomes. And so you're seeing that become more common where we're tying it all the way out to the end like that.
Definitely. And then kind of even more on that progressive spectrum of things that I wouldn't say most companies are doing this today. I would just say that there was an uptick of this in 2020 is more so trust-based philanthropy. And so what that means and what we've seen come about from that is that especially in topics where, companies will come out and say, we want to support this type of work, whether that's anti-racism work or LGBTQ work or education, health, whatever that is. A lot of times the company is not the expert in that space. They're the company. They do their services. They know what they're good at, their core offerings. They're telling a nonprofit who is the expert in that space, here are dollars. And a lot of times historically, companies will try and want to dictate how that organization uses the dollars. But what we saw emerging in 2020 and more recently is trust-based and the acknowledgement that, we are not the experts, but we are coming to you because we trust you. We want you to use these dollars. We are no longer going to apply metrics or expectations or outcomes for how you utilize these dollars. We are just going to invest in you. And we're going to trust that you are going to utilize these dollars how you see fit for that program. And so one cool company doing that is Albertsons, actually. They do a ton of community work and in a very localized way. And that's something that their foundation has recently adopted. I wouldn't say across all of their programs, but certainly for some.
So that's interesting because, I don't know, this probably goes back 10 years, but there was a big trend around organizations being able to measure the impact of nonprofits. So there were some nonprofits that were kind of caught behaving badly where, 80% of their budget was going to marketing and only 20% was actually going to the actual issues. I think Wounded Warriors got in trouble for this way back when, where most of the money that was coming in was going to marketing. I think they've since corrected that, I believe, but I know they got in a lot of trouble for it, or they at least came under a lot of pressure and scrutiny for it. Are you still seeing that as a trend? Like, are companies putting their efforts into vetting which nonprofits have big impact and then giving them sort of not a blank check, but giving them an unrestrained check to say, go take this money, do with it what you want, because you're obviously good at it? Are you seeing that checks and balance at least, or has that first part kind of gone away?
I think we're seeing both. I would still say most companies are probably still having some kind of level of expectation, but there is a really interesting opposite to that philosophy, where the thinking very differently was, we as a society have decided that we value companies and we value these executives and the amount of millions of dollars a year to go sell this widget or this product that, you don't actually need to survive. So why do we not place a similar or close value on nonprofits that are providing critical need, human-based services that society and people need to survive? So why are we as a society putting a cap on these budgets or these, earning expectations? Like, what would society look like if instead it was reversed and we were investing in these nonprofits in the same way? So I would definitely say, like, we're still seeing a lot of companies that are analyzing, and every now and then I'll come across a company that says we only support organizations that give 60% of their money to the actual programs. But most, I would say, have gotten away from that and are, probably don't have that level of restriction anymore, but certainly do evaluate it, and they want to know what that looks like. I think GuideStar is a pretty industry-wide resource for going in and taking a look at how organizations are spending their money. Charity Navigator is another one too.
Okay. Yeah. And that's interesting. I'm glad you said that. And I could totally see that. And that's, I'm in sales, right? And I'm incented to go out and grow my business to help grow Locked In, which is the company I work for. And I can make more money if I do that. And so flip that over to the philanthropy side. If you've got somebody in fundraising or marketing and they come in and they can triple your fundraising efforts, shouldn't that person be able to make a lot of money? Probably, I would argue. At the same time, if they're given 5 cents on the dollar to the actual cause that they say they're giving it to, that doesn't feel good either. So I imagine there's a sweet spot somewhere where you just have to see, ask the question and then feel comfortable with whatever your donation is.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree. There's got to be a sweet spot there. You can't be masquerading around as a nonprofit doing good if you look at the numbers and that's not coming to fruition. I also think a really interesting stat kind of related to that is that nonprofits have some of the highest turnover in any industry, and the burnout is incredibly high. So the average tenure for someone at a nonprofit is 18 months. By any business standard, that's incredibly low. You never want your average tenure for your employees to be 18 months. But that's because the burnout is so high, and the burnout is so high because you're essentially operating a business without the resources of a business. You're expected to do more with less. And so we've actually seen a trend of a lot of younger generations not wanting to go into the nonprofit space. So what is that going to mean if we as a society decide that, what does that look like? Like you're saying, how do we find that sweet spot? Yeah.
So I guess just to play this out, we may be beating a dead horse here, but there's also the factor of, are they doing what they say they're doing? Or does the work that they do have the impact they say it has? And I know that there were organizations getting better about rating nonprofits for that too. Hey, we're giving to childhood education. Okay, are these students more literate? Are they going on to graduate at higher rates with higher grades, or not? Are we just sort of spending money and not making things any better? Are you seeing those types of ratings come out as well?
That's interesting. I haven't seen it lately, but it's certainly not to say that that's not happening. I think that's probably might be more on the day-to-day for someone who is actually running these programs and actually managing the grants and funds. So I certainly do can imagine that still being a criteria that companies are looking for. I will say one criteria that I have seen trending upward are like the demographics of beneficiaries that nonprofit is supporting, or looking at like the board diversity or the executive diversity of these nonprofits, and sort of having expectations around that from a lot of companies before they're going to fund. But yeah, I could absolutely see companies wanting to take a look at those other metrics to inform their decision.
I want to ask a couple other questions, maybe just for fun as we wrap this up. What frustrates you the most that you hear in the market? I know we talked about what kind of some of the detractors say, but what are the things that you hear that just get you frustrated about this space that people just don't understand?
I wouldn't say this is my personal frustration, but I hear for people that I work with that are actually leading these programs on behalf of companies, feel like the business case has been made. The data is there, the stories are there, that I tend to hear from them that if they're in a position where they're still needing to make the business case, then that can be really challenging, right? Because it's like, we know why, kind of choosing to invest in these programs or not. So not sort of my personal, but I certainly hear that from them a lot. And then of course, I think we've seen some companies, especially kind of in the tech sector right now with layoffs, have had to cut back on some of these investments, or have had to reduce workforce and team size around some of these. And so that's also created, sort of new challenges for folks that are then, of course, needing to make sure they can justify budget and justify spend for these programs.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier that people who are the naysayers are often people who are focused on the old school shareholder value. The purpose of a business is shareholder value. One question that I ask a lot on here to guests at the end of the show is, what in your view is the purpose of business? And I'd love to hear your take on this. And I think I'd love to hear maybe your own personal take. And then also, do you hear a different take that's resonating out there in the marketplace, that you see more people rallying around a different answer than shareholder value?
Yeah, my personal take is that I think regardless of what industry you're in, what you do, who you serve, what you make, where you are, I think the purpose for any business should be humanity and to benefit people, right? Because regardless of what you do, you are somehow in some capacity working with people. And so I think valuing people's whole humanity should be the purpose of business in my particular perspective. I think for people that I work with, a lot of them would probably tie it back to the theme of what that business does and how that business is uniquely positioned to make a difference and utilize the particular skills and assets that company has to influence that part of society. And what's really cool is we're seeing companies come together in really collaborative ways in tackling different causes and issues together in a really local way too. So just last night, I was at a network event with lots of different diverse companies kind of all coming together. And, something that we've continued to see emerge is that different employee resource groups at different companies will sort of come together and do co-events together, or will come together and volunteer together. Even competitors come together and make a difference. And so I've just seen that be a really cool outcome.
Yeah, I like that. I like that response. And I think I really like the idea that it's not just about maximizing profit, but it's about maximizing the impact the organization can have in total. So can you have a maximum impact on profitability? Can you have a maximum impact on your people, on your customers, on the communities that you operate in, on the environment that we all live in, on, just can you have the maximum impact as an organization, whatever that is for your organization, not just maximizing the one piece, which is the dollars. So that's interesting. I'm going to have to think on that. I like that. Skye, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Where can people find you, learn more about Deed, and potentially engage with you if they want to do some more of this work and have Deed help them do it?
Yeah, that's super kind of you. So I, of course, LinkedIn handle Skye White, I think, -sustainability there on LinkedIn. If you want to learn a bit about Deed, check out joindeed.com. We're always also hosting different in-person events and conference events and things like that. So always can check those out virtually too. But this has been awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me to this.
Yeah, I think this is just a topic that does not get covered in full. And so I was excited to be able to have you come on and really round this out. And I would encourage anyone who's listening who wants to learn more to reach out directly to Skye. I know she's always willing to have these conversations, and it's what she does professionally. And from what I can tell, it's what she's passionate about. So I would encourage you to reach out and learn more. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.